So welcome everyone to our webinar on sanitation essentials to support your environmental monitoring program. My name is Holly and I'm a moderator for today's session. I'm pleased to welcome you to our forum, Dr. Bob. He's our presenter for today. Dr. Bob is a senior consultant and trainer with SIA Global for our assurance portfolio, and he is really the driving force behind our food safety operations as it relates to training and improvement solutions, a variety of areas, GMP, a number of GFSI standards, a wealth of information and experience in the food industry, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today.
Well, thanks, Holly, and welcome to everybody who has taken the time out of their busy schedule to listen to another topic that we feel is of great interest. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about sanitation's essentials to support your environmental monitoring program in a facility that makes ready-to-eat products. This may be beneficial to you even if you don't make ready-to-eat products, because if you make ready-to-cook or ready-to-heat, you may still want to have good environmental monitoring in your packaging area. But if you're making ready-to-eat products, it is essential that you are doing environmental monitoring. So I'm going to go through the things that I believe will be of most interest to you and your management on what you need to do to be successful in this. So we're going to talk about sanitation and building maintenance. We're going to talk about having a well-trained and effective sanitation crew, which is essential when you're trying to keep pathogens out of your packaging room. We're going to talk about the equipment and the building being maintained in good condition so that it can be kept clean. We're going to talk about you trying to find Listeria monocytogenes or species in your packing room. And the more you look for it, and the more you don't find it, that's good. But if you miss it because you're not really being robust, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what do you do if I do find a positive in my packaging room? And then what am I going to do if I find a positive, get rid of it? What do I do to stop it getting back in to my packaging area? These are hot issues with the FDA. And we've heard about the FDA going into facilities and doing swabathons. So we're going to do our first poll and our only poll today, and Holly's going to ask you the questions and tell you how to fill in the answers.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Dr. Bob. So what's your greatest challenge within your environmental monitoring program? So we have 5 options. Let me launch the poll. Give you about 30 seconds to select the response that's most appropriate for your organization. So perhaps it's just acquiring management commitment, getting that buy-in that it's a priority and needs resources and funding. Perhaps it's staff training, adequately trained staff to manage an EMP. Maybe it's equipment maintenance and how to service and maintain equipment around that. Challenges with swabbing, or perhaps it's that root cause analysis in preventing recontamination. So we'll leave it open for about 15 seconds to capture the response, and we'll share the results in a moment here. What's been your experience, Dr. Bob? What's the greatest challenge folks have with their EMPs?
Well, first of all, if you're not used to swabbing, I think that's your first challenge, and therefore you need to maybe get help from one of the companies that sell swabs on how to do it. The second thing is, if you find a positive, how do you do effective root cause analysis to find out what it's coming from? Because if you don't do that, it'll continue to be there because you can't find out what it's living.
Yeah, certainly. All right, so we are at almost 100% here. We'll close and share. Pretty even spread. Challenge was actually the lowest, but a pretty even spread across the rest. So clearly a very large variety of challenges across the board for these folks.
All right, well, that does disappoint me a little because the first step is management commitment. So if you had a pretty even split across the people responding, some of them are not getting management commitment. I don't know what it's going to take for management to understand it. It's the law. It is required, and if they don't get on top of it, the consequences we'll talk about later can be pretty drastic. Now, we are going to take questions. So remember, Holly said to put whatever questions you've got into the chat room, and we will have a Q&A session at the end and try to answer as many questions as possible. But your environmental monitoring program and your seriousness in approaching it obviously is based on management commitment. Because if you haven't got the support of management, you're not going to be very successful. if they're not going to give you the money to have adequate staffing, if they're not going to give you the time, if they're not going to be serious in providing you money to buy the swabs and get them analyzed, if they don't realize the potential disaster that's waiting to happen, if you finish up with Listeria monocytogenes in your packaging room and you're making a ready-to-eat product, the FDA is going to take action against you. And if it finishes up in the product, you're going to get into a massive recall. And if you finish up getting people sick, you're going to have lawyers coming after you. So I don't know why management doesn't realize this is not a nice to do, this is something you've got to do. And it is the law, and it is in effect right now. Now, in order to be successful in cleaning up your environment, cleaning up your equipment, trying to avoid having Listeria in the room and getting rid of it, you need to have competent and an effective sanitation group. And the FDA has gone on record that when they've gone into plants, they found a lack of competency in the sanitation supervisors. They found a lack of understanding of the sanitation people of the importance of what they're doing. And therefore, the other problem is management cuts down the amount of time that sanitation has to do the job. Second shift runs long. Third shift is sanitation. First shift comes on early in the morning at 6 a.m. when the plant's ready to start again. Sanitation hasn't finished because second shift ran till 1:30 in the morning. They were supposed to be out by midnight. And nobody's allowing the sanitation people enough time to clean, and they're going, okay, we don't have any more time for cleaning. Let's get production started. And we've seen that a problem. We've seen that with an ice cream plant who got in trouble on that. We've also seen the fact that sanitation people tend to be some of the lower paid people in a plant. Yet they're some of the most important people in your plant. And if you've got well-trained, dedicated sanitation people who are adequately rewarded for their efforts, given the time to do it, they're worth every dollar you're paying them. Particularly when you're making ready-to-eat products where if you get a pathogen in them, the consumer's going to eat the product, and there's nothing that the consumer's going to do to make the product any safer. Now, if you're making ready to cook or you're making maybe ready to heat, you may say, well, the consumer's going to do something. Therefore, sanitation in the packaging room isn't as critical. That may be true. It certainly is very true that it's critical when you're making ready-to-eat products. Because if not, then you're going to be into recalls, you're going to be into regulatory action, and you're going to be into lawsuits. And I'm not going to go through some of those examples, but there's plenty of those examples out there where it finished up costing companies so much money that they finished up being closed down because they went bankrupt, or they finished up having the regulators close them because they couldn't get rid of the Listeria in the packaging room. So sanitation isn't the only issue, obviously. You've got to keep your building and equipment in good condition. So do you have adequate time for the people to do the building maintenance? Do you have committed maintenance people who understand that if the packaging room isn't in good condition, you can start developing a lot of harborage sites for Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, depending on the type of pathogens that your products would have as foreseeable hazards. So how many cracks do you have in the floor? How much caulking is missing between floor tiles? Have you gone over and looked at the floor wall junctions or the wall junctions to see if there's any cracks there? Have you looked under the legs of the equipment that are now sealed to the floor that one day in the past they were sealed to the floor? And now water's getting under there, Listeria is getting under there, and you can't get rid of it because you need to get under there, clean it out, seal it up. Have you got any hollow supports on maybe equipment where stuff can get in, but you can't clean? Have you thought about the carts, the garbage cans, the stuff that comes into that room? And have you made sure that you're cleaning the wheels, cleaning underneath those things? Have you got motors that once upon a time were sealed, and the sealing is broken, the gasket is deteriorated, the corking around it is gone, and now all of a sudden you've got an area where bacteria can get in, and you now are not cleaning in there, and now this is the source of where the Listeria is. Are you cleaning on the conveyors or just cleaning on top of the conveyors? And therefore, it's not only maintenance, it's the fact, can they clean? Do they have the ability to take the covers off switches or off motors, etc., if this is where the Listeria could be? Think about the cooling unit condensate pans. It'll grow warm, but it likes cold. It likes moist, and therefore it loves condensate water. So how are your units, your condensate pans, do you ever get up there and clean them out? Do you put a quartz sanitizer in there, which can be a solid that can gradually start to dissolve and keep those condensate pans free of harmful pathogens? Now, I've been around for years. I've been involved in the industry where we had Listeria problems in '85 in the dairy industry. And the dairy industry got into putting a lot of these solid quartz sanitizers into their condensate pans. Because if the water pools in there and you don't have any sanitizer in there and your sanitation crew's not going to get up there every night and clean them, then what's in there to try to act to inhibit the Listeria being there or to kill it if it is there? How about those equipment switches where your people go over and they push a button to start a line, start a package machine, and then they push the button again, turn it off? Is that part of your sanitation? That may be where the Listeria is, on that switch, around that switch. Now, you got to be real careful, obviously, because now we're talking electric, so it's not like you want people getting into doing things that will endanger them, but can you power those things off and then clean them? How about the tables in that room? Are you cleaning the legs? Are you cleaning the wheels? Are you cleaning the top? But you forgot to do the underside of the table. This is where you're going to find the Listeria. But that wasn't where you were cleaning. That wasn't where you were looking. Nobody ever turned the table over and cleaned the underside of it. How about the air handling units going into this room? Are you bringing the Listeria in that way? Do you ever clean it? And if this room's a negative air pressure, and we'll talk a minute later about making it a positive air pressure, then you're going to be sucking Listeria into that room. How about that floor drains? Are they damaged? I go into some places, I see some really damaged floor drains that over the years, the concrete's deteriorating, the tile that comes up to the drain, and the corking's coming out and stuff's getting under there. And you're giving the sanitation people an impossible task to clean. If you got those trench drains, I'm going to tell you, unless you really need them, I'd get rid of them. There is nothing more difficult to clean than a trench drain. There's nothing more difficult to keep in good condition than a trench drain. So if you don't need them and you got them, talk about what would it take to just fill them over, get rid of them. Now, obviously, if you need a drain in that room, don't just cover the whole floor drain, then trench drain, and then not have a drain. How about the cleaning equipment that's used in that room? Is it dedicated to that room, to that packaging room and a ready-to-eat operation? Or do you take it to other parts of the plant and then you bring it back and bring the Listeria with it? You need to dedicate it. Now, that takes commitment, that takes money, that takes management feeling that that's a positive, and it is. Because if you can dedicate the equipment to that room and never have it leave and use it to clean. Now, don't forget to clean that sanitation equipment, because just because it's dedicated doesn't mean that you leave it. So if you got something like a wet dry vac in there and you never open it up and clean it, then you could find the Listerias living in your wet dry vac, because everybody thinks that used to suck up water or solid materials or whatever, and then you just leave it. You got to have a cleaning program for that. So what have we talked about up to now? We've talked about having a well-trained, dedicated sanitation group with a competent supervisor who are rewarded for doing a great job and recognized as an important part of the plant. We then talked about having management commitment in order to support that. We then talked about maintenance having enough time to repair and fix the building as well as the equipment, and not be fighting fires all the time where they don't have time to do that. That's called adequate resources. We know the FDA is coming in and they're going to be looking for the competency of your sanitation group. They're going to be looking for the commitment from your senior management. They're going to be looking for the fact that the building's in good shape. And they're going to see what you don't want them to see if those are not positive answers to those questions. So now we now decide how we're going to find Listeria if it's there, because we've got to find it. Because if it's there, we've got to find it. And having found it, we've got to find out what it's living, and we've got to get rid of it. So therefore, our program has to be designed to try to find it, not to not find it. So if you're incentivizing your employees not to find it, it's not the right type of approach. Because what are you doing? You're just fooling yourself. Because if it's there, it's going to finish up on your product one day. It's going to get people sick. It could possibly kill people. You're going to have regulatory action. You're going to get sued simply because you said, we'll do some swabbing and we'll never find a positive, so therefore we've got a great room. No, you've got a great room if you don't find a positive because you aggressively went looking for it. So when you want to swab, you don't want to swab when it's clean in that room. Yet I go to places and people say, oh yeah, we do our swabbing during environmental monitoring. We do it after the sanitation group is finished, and they've cleaned everything up and they've sanitized everything and they've run sanitizer all over the floor and run sanitizer down the drains, and we never find any Listeria. And you go, not surprising. But was it there half an hour earlier, 2 hours earlier? Was it there at the end of production when the product was exposed? I don't know. We don't swab at that time. Well, that's when you're supposed to swab. You're supposed to swab while the stuff's all over the floor, while your equipment's filthy. We're talking about swabbing environmental food contact surfaces. You want to swab when the conditions are at their worst. Because if you don't find Listeria monocytogenes or Listeria species at that time, then the chances are it's not there. But if you wait until it's all clean and sanitized, then it may have been there and you just got rid of it. But it doesn't mean it wasn't there. It doesn't mean you hadn't got a chance of putting out a product with it in. So you say, well, what should I do? Well, most plants go with the 4 zones. And what you do is the further you move away from food contact surfaces, the more the number goes from 1 to 4. And the more frequently you'll swab is closer to where the product's exposed. Now, the one thing that's different about the FDA is the FDA currently does not require you, though they're advising you to do it, and this may change tomorrow, they're not mandating that you swab a food contact surface. So unless you really want to do that, I would recommend you don't. Now, USDA doesn't give you that choice, nor does CFIA in Canada. You have to swab. But remember, in Canada, you can have a little bit of Listeria in a product, and depending on if it's low and the product won't support the growth of it, that's not a problem. But in America, you cannot have Listeria in any USDA or FDA product, no matter how low it is. Zone 1, therefore, is food contact surfaces. Zone 2 is the rest of that packaging area. Zone 3 would be rooms just outside that where you're storing stuff and they support this operation in the packaging room. And Zone 4 would be other areas which you designate like maintenance shops, like employee break rooms, etc. So where am I going to swab? Well, you're going to swab while it's unclean. You're going to swab where you believe the pathogen could be. And therefore, you're going to swab anywhere that you can reach, that you think a hose can rinse stuff out from underneath stuff. You're going to swab as much as you possibly can to try to find it. Therefore, you want to swab large areas with each swab. Now, you can't swab the whole room with one swab, but you can swab large areas. And then later, if you get a positive, you can come back and narrow down to that area and say, we just swabbed a 6-foot area and we found Listeria. Well, then you can zone in on that 6 foot. But if you don't get a positive and you swab 6 foot, then the chances are there's nothing in that 6-foot area. You say, shall I actually be swabbing and looking for Listeria monocytogenes, or can I do Listeria species? Well, you can do Listeria species, and it's a lot cheaper. But then assume that if you find Listeria species, that it could be Listeria monocytogenes, and don't spend any extra money getting a lab to confirm it. Just assume it's a positive. But use an accredited lab. Make sure they are accredited to do Listeria testing. They are certified to ISO 17025. And therefore, there's not going to be any questions about the credibility of the lab analysis. Then you say, well, we do all that, and we don't find any positives. Then you can decrease your frequency. So you say, well, what frequency should I start with? Well, actually, CFIA has done a very good job of recommending what you do depending on the type of product you've got and whether it'll support or not support the growth of Listeria. USDA and FDA have given you some guidance as well. But you really need to establish your own frequency. I would start off being fairly frequent to start with, and then I would start to decrease the number of swabs if I'm not finding positives. But you can't decrease it to where you're not doing it at all. So whether you're going to say, I'm going to swab weekly to start with, then I'm going to drop off to monthly, then I'm going to drop off to quarterly, then maybe I'm going to drop off to twice a year, starts to sound like that may be a little too infrequent. But again, the risk is with your senior management. And they're the ones who are going to be held accountable by the FDA, CFIA, and USDA if you finish up having problems. But they're the ones who are going to give you the time to do the swabbing, pay for the swabs, and pay for the analysis. So therefore, that's when we go back to management commitment. Because now I find it. Well, what am I going to do about it? Well, first of all, I better do something about it, because if I'm doing ready-to-eat products, I'm about one step away from possibly having my area of my plant closed down. Maybe not the whole plant closed down, but that area closed down, because I can't continue to be packing off an exposed ready-to-eat product in a packaging area where there's Listeria monocytogenes there. So therefore, having found it, I'm now going to eliminate it, and I got to find out where it is living. So when you get a positive, you've got to sit down with as many key people as possible, certainly QA people, sanitation and maintenance personnel, and say, hey, we're finding it. Where do you think it is? Where do you think the equipment's not maybe in as good condition, so there's a crack, a crevice, or something where it could be? Where's the building not in such good a thing? How do we feel that it's living? Where do we feel it's living? Let's go back now and let's do re-swabbing of smaller areas closer to where we believe it may be. Having got to an area that may be bigger, like 6 foot square, but at least we know it's that 6 foot square. I'm not going to swab anywhere else now. I'm going back to that 6 foot square. Don't be going to the drain all the time and saying, well, we keep finding it in the drain. Yes, the chances are you are, because it's running across the floor and going in the drain, but that's not where it's harbored. So now you got to go from what is close to the drain. Where do you think it's running from? Now I need to start going back to there to see if I can find a little niche, a little hole, a little area where it could be, so that I can, one, get under that niche, get into that niche, get that niche dried, get it sealed, and get rid of the harborage area for the Listeria. Because if I don't, it's going to continue to leach out from there across the floor. Now, I'll give you examples. I've been into plants. One was a dairy and had a conveyor. And they weren't finding any Listeria monocytogenes in their room at the end of production. They weren't finding it after cleanup or before cleanup. But when they were swabbing during actual running, they noticed after about an hour, Listeria was showing up in the room. So something was happening in that first hour. Conveyors were running, motors were running, things were starting to get warmed up. Chances are the Listeria was coming out of a motor housing. It was coming out of a conveyor, the bearings on a conveyor. They started swabbing in there, and that's where they found it. So it doesn't mean that you're just going to necessarily swab at the end of production. You may want to swab after an hour's worth of production, 2 hours worth of production, because you're trying to find it. And it doesn't matter whether it's coming in that room with the product or whether it's coming into that room from something else. You've got to find out how it's coming in that room. And if it's coming in that room with the product, then you've got to go further upstream, because you already got a contaminated ready-to-eat product, which wasn't getting contaminated in the packaging area. It was getting contaminated in the next area up. But it was at that stage it was ready to eat as well. And at that stage it was being conveyed without any covers on it. And it was already contaminated before it came in your packaging area. So maybe your packaging area isn't the problem. Well, we have to understand Listeria monocytogenes forms colonies called biofilms. They get surrounded by proteins and sugars, making them harder to clean away. They sometimes become resistant to sanitizers. So one of the effective ways is to change your sanitizer every few months. Use a quartz sanitizer a few months, switch to a acetic acid sanitizer, and maybe even to an iodine sanitizer, which the dairies have used for years, and you rotate them. And therefore, you don't have a Listeria that builds up a resistance to one sanitizer. And for those of you who know quartz sanitizers, they're also detergents. They're very good at cleaning as well as sanitizing. So that's a sanitizer that's a detergent and a sanitizer, whereas a lot of the other sanitizers are sanitizers only. Hot water and steam can be effective. So if you've got a steam line and you can use it to steam some of your equipment, hot water. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a soap, doesn't necessarily have to be a sanitizer. If you can actually clean and sanitize your equipment with hot water and steam, and some industries do that. Be careful that you're not blowing the Listeria all around the room by hitting it with a steam hose and just putting it up in the air. Can you get all your equipment apart? Can your sanitation people get all your equipment apart so they can get into every nook and cranny, every dead end, every part of a pipe, unless you're doing CIP, and then make sure you're getting 5 cubic feet per second in flow rate. Otherwise, you're not cleaning your pipes properly. Make sure if you've got CIP and you're spraying, your spray nozzles are effective and they're not partially blocked and the spray pattern's there. Now, these are places where you can go get help from your sanitizing, from your chemical company, because they're very well versed in how to clean, obviously. They can be very good at training your employees. They can also be very good as an extra pair of eyes. And remember, you can seek help from outside. We can also give you help if you need. But I would like to see you go and see your chemical company see the lab that's going to do the swabbing, and get advice from them. After that, if you feel like you need help, we're around. Now you just say to yourself, well, how would I know it's not a new Listeria that came in the room? So therefore, how would you know it's the same one that stayed in the room that I didn't get rid of versus I just keep reintroducing Listeria in the room? Well, they can do genome sequencing now. Each Listeria has its own DNA. So once it's gone, it's gone. And when they do it, and I'm not suggesting you get into this sophisticated testing, this is expensive, but the FDA may if you have a problem. Then they'll be able to show that the Listeria in your room is the same one that was there a month ago, 2 months ago, 6 months ago, and it isn't a new one. And yet you're convinced we just keep bringing it in the room. We keep bringing it into our plant with our raw materials. It's a battle that we're fighting, and it isn't a battle of something living in that room all the time. Those are two different things. They're both Listeria, and one is resident, therefore it never left. The other one you are reintroducing, we'll talk about that in a minute. How are you going to stop bringing it back, a new Listeria back in the room? Because if it becomes resident and you can't get rid of it, you don't need me to tell you that the FDA is possibly going to close your plant down. And again, I could quote you examples of where they've already done that. So how am I going to prevent it getting back in the room, having got rid of it, knowing that I'm bringing Listeria into my plant? Because some of you are. It's what they call ubiquitous. It comes in with soil. And therefore, you could, by the nature of your raw materials, your ingredients, you could be bringing it in. Therefore, you have to recognize I am bringing it in. So what am I going to do to prevent it getting into the packaging area when I'm packing a ready-to-eat product? Yes, it's going to be in the rest of my plants, but that's fine, because I had a step in my process that took care of it. But the last thing I want is for it to get back in the product at the final packaging stage when I'm making a ready-to-eat product. So how am I going to stop it? Because it has a 20 to 25% mortality rate. So what are we talking about? We're talking about people eating the product with it in, and 20 to 25% of them are going to die. 60 to 65% of them are going to go to hospital. So it's not like we're talking about a pathogen that has like a 5% chance of killing you, and it has maybe a 10 or 15% chance of putting you in hospital. We're talking about a very deadly bacteria here. So you can understand why the FDA is very concerned about you putting out ready-to-eat products that could have Listeria monocytogenes in them. So therefore, they're concentrating now on coming to visit you if you're making ready-to-eat products and doing swabathons in your packaging area. Well, if you've done a good job and you found it and got rid of it yourself, there's a pretty good chance they're not going to find it. But if your management isn't committed and they've short-circuited you on how much money you can spend or how many swabs you can do or how well you're going to train your sanitation group or how long you're going to give your sanitation group, then there's a pretty good chance the FDA may find it, and then they're going to require things of you. So what are you going to do to try to make the fact that I'm going to keep Listeria out of the room? I'm going to encourage you to enclose this area. So now it's a packaging room, not a packaging area. It isn't at the end of the production line and there's one big room with a production line in it. And you can do this with little curtains that you can hang and pull over. You can do it by putting up walls around the place. But if you can limit this area to a smaller area, you've got less area that you have to keep Listeria free. Dedicate employees to this area, and only they are allowed in this room, and nobody else goes in this room. And they're dressed in different clothing to other people. And once they get this clothing on, they go into production, and when they leave production, they go back and they get back into their own clothes. You capture their footwear. The last thing you want is somebody coming in that room with footwear on that was outside. That was outside at their house, was outside when they were coming to work. Now, if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to be fighting Listeria forever. Dedicate equipment to this area. So not only equipment to package the product, but dedicate other things like pallet jacks, like sanitation equipment, like pallets. Dedicate everything in this room that it's only going to be used in this room. And if you can have your product go out of that room before it's put on a pallet, don't even let pallets in that room. And if you are going to let pallets in that room, plastic pallets that can be washed. Control people from going into that area, including supervisors, simply because they're going to be carrying stuff on their shoes, their clothing, from other areas where there's a chance that you've got Listeria in there. And the last thing you want is them taking that into that room. So when we talk about product flow, we have to remember people flow. And people should be flowing from the packaging area to the dirty, and I use that word in italics area, and not the other way. Keep everything out of that room that has nothing to do with that room. If you can put a positive air pressure in there, that'll be even better. But now that takes a lot of redoing your plant. It may be a step that's beyond your capabilities. But if you can, you would have a positive air, so therefore everything's blowing out of that room and nothing's blowing in. Holly, what type of questions do we have from the folks?
Lots of questions, Dr. Bob. Let's dive right in here. Thanks very much for that presentation. Very good overview. Lots of detail in there. All right. So, first question. Can you just clarify, is previous one? I'm not sure what the context of this, Dr. Bob, but an FDA Zone 1, do you recommend testing or not testing in an FDA Zone 1?
Well, Zone 1, if you're talking food contact surfaces, I would say until the FDA mandates that you have to do it, you have to make that decision yourself. Some plants are doing it, even though the FDA doesn't mandate it. When it's USDA and CFIA, you don't have a choice.
Okay. Does a canned facility that has a retorted product kill step require an EMP? And if so, which pathogen needs to be tested, or should all of them?
Well, obviously, one of the things products is going to have further processing. And let's talk about just further processing. Let's say, for instance, you're going to take your meat products that have been packaged and they're sliced meats and they're ready to eat, and you're going to do high pressure pasteurization, then you don't have to worry about doing environmental monitoring. If you're going to put some type of listericide, so something in the product, if it's legal, like lactate, sodium lactate, potassium lactate, then again, you could have your product have Listeria in it and it will be killed off. Now, when you talk about canning, obviously you're going to can after you've already canned the product. And you're going to cook it at temperatures that are going to be far above what it takes to kill anything. So I wouldn't be worrying about environmental pathogens other than Clostridium botulinum. And then I'll be worrying about if I didn't process it right, I'll be growing botulism. So low acid canning is different. We're talking about products that are ready to eat, where there isn't a heat step coming later, but in canning, you can and then heat.
Okay. Does the FDA look at presumptives in almost the same light as positives?
No, the FDA would look at the presumptive, and then they would go ahead and confirm it, and then they would say you've got Listeria monocytogenes. What my recommendation is to assume that a presumptive is Listeria monocytogenes and save your money. Don't spend it with the lab doing the extra testing to say it's there, because if it is there, you just spent a whole lot of money. So why not assume it's there and just make sure you get rid of presumptives as well?
Okay. You answered, I think, both of these questions. We'll just touch on this just to make sure. Is an EMP mandatory for non-ready-to-eat products? And second question is an EMP for Zone 1 mandatory for only RTE, ready-to-eat products?
Well, the answer is no, it's not mandatory for products that are not ready to eat, but it is mandatory for ready to eat products. And so it's up to you whether you want to do environmental monitoring for other products that are not ready to eat. Now, if your customer says he wanted to do it, and some customers do, then you're going to be driven by your customers rather than by the regulators.
Yeah, okay. After swabbing, we sanitize with the area with a sanitizing chemical. Is this adequate without cleaning the surface first?
No, it's not. You can't sanitize over dirt. And so therefore, what you would be doing is you have to clean, then you have to sanitize. And that is the orders. Clean, rinse, and sanitize.
Okay. Can you comment on whether there is research out there on how bad it is to use power washers on floors at spreading Listeria? This webinar attendee has indicated that she struggles to convince management that this is a poor choice.
Well, I totally agree with you. I'm sure if I was to Google, I'd find somebody who has a paper out on that. But you're right. If you're going to use a power washer, you're just going to blow the stuff up in the air and it's going to go all over the place. That's the last thing you want to do. Just the same as I used to go into spice plants and I used to see them using airlines and therefore air pressure to blow the spices all over the place. And then it would go up on the rafters and go everywhere versus using a vacuum to suck it out. And so I would say I would avoid using high pressure, particularly in the packaging area where you're going to be blowing anything around. And that's allergens, Salmonella, Listeria. And that was one thing I didn't mention. Remember, if Salmonella is a pathogen that's like in your operation, then you should be swabbing for that as well. And if you're bringing in meat products where E. coli is well likely to be a foreseeable hazard, you should be swabbing for that as well.
Yep. Okay. Is it wise to swab for both Listeria and Salmonella in both wet processing and dry packaging areas? Or should we mainly focus on swabbing for Listeria in the wet and Salmonella in the dry?
Well, that's a good advice right there. Yes, generally the FDA considers that Salmonella is more likely to be in a warm environment that's dry. Listeria is more likely to be in a cold environment that's wet. And if you know the way that Salmonella grows, Salmonella won't grow below 41 degrees, but Listeria will grow all the way down to freezing temperatures. And so therefore, Listeria tends to survive very well in cold, wet areas simply because Salmonella is not competing with it. But you have to make that decision yourself. There's nothing that says you can't swab for Listeria and Salmonella in both dry and in wet areas. But predominantly, you would be expected to do Listeria in a wet, cold area, and you would be expected to do Salmonella if it is a foreseeable hazard with your type of products in a dry environment.
Yeah, okay. I work for a company that manufactures paperboard packaging products. Where do you suggest we swab?
Well, it's interesting because one of the questions I was asked just recently was, would Listeria be a problem in a packaging plant? Well, generally seeing they're dry and all that, I would say the likelihood is not very high. But if your customer is concerned that you may have Listeria and it may be on the packaging and it's going to get in the product, they may require you to do it. So the question is, why are you doing it? Are you doing it because your customer wants you to do it, or are you doing it because you think the regulator wants you to do it?
Yep. Okay, very good. Thank you. Does a storage and distribution warehouse need to conduct testing with no exposed product?
Nope.
Okay, yeah, easy enough.
But again, and that question sometimes comes up because somebody says, well, the SQF auditor or the BLC auditor came in and said we have to do environmental monitoring. No, both SQF and BLC says you have to do a risk assessment, and then based on that risk assessment, you determine there is no need to do but you have to have that in writing and show it to the auditor. So don't get caught on that one, because everybody says, well, I don't have to do it because the products I carry are all enclosed. You have to do a risk assessment and say, because they're all enclosed, we do not need to do it. Now you start repacking stuff and you start exposing it, it's a different ball game.
Yeah, and that was the next question. If we're repackaging this, in this example, fresh lettuce, do we need to conduct the environmental testing? And the answer would be, of course, looking at that risk assessment and the results of that, right?
And the answer would be, yes, you would, because now you've taken a product and you've actually exposed it in a warehouse area where it could get contaminated with Listeria, and you now have to say there's a probability that I could contaminate it, so now I better be swabbing. You may be swabbing less frequently, but remember, Listeria is coming in. And it depends on what you're doing. Now, if you're going to do, and that's the lettuce as it comes out of the field, well, the chances are that it could have Listeria on it anyway, and your customer is going to take it and do something with it. So is it ready to eat at that stage? If you're now going to take it and you're going to start washing it and maybe dicing it and packaging it as a ready-to-eat salad, now you're into manufacturing and not really into repacking the lettuce as it comes out of the field.
Yeah. What happens if the Listeria tests are consistently negative, 4+ years? Do they still need to do their risk assessment? What's the call to action there?
Well, no. Basically, when your risk assessment is, should I swab in the first place? And then how often should I swab, etc. But you can't not swab, and you can't decrease the frequency to where you're not swabbing at all. And I would have said before, if you decrease it to once a year, I think you're just fooling yourself that you're going to be able to keep Listeria out of that room for a whole year. And maybe twice a year is not frequent enough. But now whether you want to go 4 times a year, that's up to you. But remember, as you decrease your frequency, you increase your risk. But risk has to be part of what you do your determination on.
Okay. So going back, this webinar attendees asked, we are not holding finished product when we do environmental testing on FCS and FSCS. And an FDA inspector challenge us on holding a product moving forward.
So read that question again.
Mm-hmm. Currently, we are not holding finished product when we do the environmental testing. Can the FDA inspector challenge us on holding a product moving forward?
If you are swabbing a food contact surface, then obviously the FDA would challenge why you didn't hold the product until you got the result. But on an environmental monitoring, it's up to you whether you want to hold it or not, because if you get negatives, then there's no possibility that the product was contaminated. If you get a positive, it doesn't necessarily mean the product was contaminated, but it would raise the issue, should I not now test the product? And so therefore the risk is now going to have to be determined by your management, because if you then tested the product, or if the FDA then picked up the product and they found it, you're now into a recall.
Yeah, okay. Can you comment on vector swabbing? Is there any guidance around that?
What type of swabbing?
Vector, V as in Victor, vector swabbing?
Oh, vector, that's up to you again. That's another way of doing it. But again, are you finding it? Are you not finding it? Are you not finding it because you're not doing the testing the right way? That's why I said I would definitely get advice from labs. But be careful again. They may want you to go totally overboard, and they may be pushing more swabbing, more testing, because that's their business. And you have to determine yourself, where is the point where that advice is good for me as well as good for them, and not just good for them and maybe cost me too much money.
Yep, okay. In areas that are mostly dry clean only, without wet sanitation, what is a suggestion or recommendation on controlling the transient effect that you mentioned earlier?
Well, again, I think it's coming in on people's clothing, and that's why, as I said, one of the things that the FDA is concerned about, let's talk about allergens. Let's talk about how does an allergen get from one end of the plant to another and get in a product that's going to be packaged, and now you got a ready-to-eat product that gets an allergen in it that's not on the label. Well, the FDA has shown is quite often that's transient because it comes in on people's clothing who you allow to come in the packaging area. Or you don't have any ability to catch the powdered allergen when you're dumping it in a mixer, so it just floats across the plant and finishes out the packaging again. So you can get dried things coming that way, and they generally come in on equipment like pallet jacks and stuff like that, pallets. And so you want to be careful, not just for pathogens, but also for allergens. What am I taking into that packaging room that's going to give me a problem in that finished product, either because it's an allergen, it's not on the label, or it's a pathogen and it shouldn't be in the product?
Yeah, okay. How would you vector a switch with a presumptive? So I'm not sure if I understand that. Employees' hands, would that be a personnel issue?
Well, yeah, that's why, again, we always talk about the fact that everybody has to wash their hands. You have to know when to change the gloves. And that's why I was talking about the switches. What the FDA has found in some of their swabbing, that when they've gone over and they swabbed the switch over to the side of a packaging machine, they found Listeria there. And yet the employee's going over there with a gloved hand, pushing that button all the time, then going back and touching the packaging, or actually almost touching the product with Listeria on the hand that's coming from a switch that wasn't part of the sanitation crew spending much time cleaning that switch.
Okay. Sorry, follow-up question. I heard a comment about a Salmonella being more likely for dry. Is that what you are referencing?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Great question. Can you comment on monitoring raw coffee and roasted coffee manufacturing areas?
Well, where the coffee industry's got themselves into the ready-to-eat business is because they're now selling ready-to-eat or ready-to-drink coffee drinks, iced coffee and stuff like that. Whereas beforehand, you would have said coffee isn't a ready-to-eat product. It comes, and therefore you have coffee beans or ground coffee beans, and then you pour hot water through them, and the consumer or the retailer is making the ready-to-eat drink then. But now they're selling the thing. The FDA now considers those as ready-to-eat products. So now you've got the ability to get Listeria into that ready-to-eat iced coffee. So now you're going to have to do the swabbing in that room now because you're packing off a ready-to-eat product.
Okay. All right. What are your thoughts on employees that work at a paperboard packaging producer on wearing gloves with handling paperboard products?
Well, again, I think there has to be a policy of changing the gloves. I think it's great that they're wearing the gloves. Sometimes they're wearing the gloves to just protect their hands from getting like cardboard little cuts in their hand or something like that. So sometimes the gloves are for personal protection. Protect people who don't wash their hands so well, putting their hands on the packaging materials and then getting on the packaging materials what you don't want on your packaging material, which will then finish up getting in the food that's going to go in there. I think you need to make sure that you've got a glove policy on how often should those gloves be changed if they're disposable, and how often should they be laundered if they're non-disposable.
Okay, wonderful. That's great. That's the close of the hour, and we have all of the questions addressed. So, Dr. Bob, thank you very much for your time and your presentation, and thanks to everyone for your attendance. Have a great day.
Thank you.